happy to introduce to you Eugenia Stamboliev, who is one of the organizers of the Winter School and also our next speaker. So Dr. Eugenia Stamboliev is a media philosopher and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna. She works on ethical issues around artificial intelligence and algorithmic structures and data structures, while focusing mainly on political, socioeconomic, and normative concerns. Her present fellowship in the WWTF project Interpretability and Explainability as Drivers to Democracy focuses on the influence of complex algorithmic structures, like for example, in COVID models, on democratic values and concepts, and examines conceptual shifts in institutional power, social trust, and explainability. Eugenia has also worked specifically on ethical topics of care robots, as the conflicts between seeing them as companions or as data valence, mainly during her PhD. And I'm very much looking forward to her perspective on the performative ethics of care robots that she is going to talk to us about now.
Thank you very much, and thanks for everyone who's still awake and listening and collecting all their energy. I wish I could tell you it's very easy to listen to talk. I think you have to still focus and concentrate quite a bit, because I want to make a few moves, but I try to include lots of visuals, so I hope it's going to be at least illustrative to some extent. I'm going to share my screen now. Don't get scared. I use a very bright color for everyone to wake up. My title would be just one aspect of my presentation. And I guess the overall idea is I try to provoke a little bit the ethical boundaries of more or less my own discipline, or the discipline I'm working in at the moment. I would like to say a bit also as well to Bojana's talk before, because there were many overlaps between what she's doing, what I was very interested in and still am. But I shifted a little bit in disciplinary focus. My background is in media studies, but media studies not in the sense of like the English media studies, but more from a German-speaking perspective, like German media theory. So it's slightly more material, and you will see it in my way of approaching robot ethics. And then when I started doing my PhD at the beginning, I was doing film studies, and I was very much interested in the visualization of technology and of also self through technology, or ideas of self. And interestingly, I started to work on, for me at least, interestingly, but I started to work on robots, and on specifically then on care robots, through my association with performance studies. So I entered the discipline and the ethical from a completely different angle. At the same time, when I did my PhD on what was called transdisciplinary studies, and I focused then on media studies and on media philosophy, I already had undertaken basically 3 years of a PhD in philosophy. So I'm equally trained in media studies, but also in philosophy, but I always felt a bit like not quite happy with certain discussions in so-called robot ethics. I apologize to everyone who feels like, oh, well, but this is actually so much more than you just talk about, because it is. I will generalize a little bit. Again, it's a bit of a provocation. The main point is to discuss and even get your input if you want to share. What kind of angles are we missing when we talk about constellations between robots and human beings? And Bojana was very good in just showing up that even just the idea of artistic practice, where so many agency discussions are being led, not, I wouldn't say even at the moment, but since forever, would really be such a valuable input to certain discussions, even in the ethical field. I hope as well that roboticists can profit for them as well, because this is not just a presentation on ethics for ethicists and for philosophers, but I'm very strongly convinced that if ethics, it opens up a little bit towards other disciplines, this also means that roboticists can profit more from ethics or from getting more involved in ethical concerns. Maybe another thing, to give you more context, even why, you know, I feel like I'm sitting in between so many chairs. When I did my second PhD then in interdisciplinary studies and started to work on care robots, I didn't just shift from media studies or from film studies to philosophy of robots, but I was at the same time in a program working with roboticists. So I then actually looked out and asked them, like, what are you working on? Like, what's the context? And I guess this also informed my quite empathetic and sympathetic view for certain practical issues, which I also consider to be very, well, sometimes overlooked in the ethical debates. And I'm definitely one of these people who thinks that each angle needs to get so much more involved in other disciplines as well to inform their own discipline. Yeah, because I mean, I could see it yesterday in actually Tony's presentation when he shared, you know, how many technical issues there are still in robotics, and this doesn't always, synchronize with how we lead certain ethical discussions. And I think this is where then the divide happens between theory and practice, that the two sides don't feel necessarily they properly link. And again, I'm generalizing. This doesn't mean that there are not amazing, you know, things opening up. But I guess as I move through my discussion, you will see maybe more precisely what I mean by I want to shake up a little bit the disciplinary boundaries. Oh, of course, now I have slides only view, but unfortunately I have to do it like this. Okay, so I will repeat that maybe a few times to be really, really clear. Because this is a difference now to other ethical discussions you might normally hear. I will not talk about ethical issues of robots. I will not discuss why robots are a problem, not a problem, and so on and so forth. My ethical discussion is more like a meta-ethical discussion on ethics and on the disciplinary boundaries of ethics as a field. I know that there is not a field as such, but let's say just, you know, bear with me and we'll see if that actually becomes a problem. So again, limits of ethical frameworks. And one of the drivers of doing this, and I do this throughout my quite short career, but it seems like almost like my narrative that I try to push those kind of boundaries. The other value of this work is, or the other input I had to get to this point is also can be seen in my work at the moment with political philosophy and AI. So those kind of issues can be transformed into other ways and other forms of robots as well. I will talk about care robots because this was actually the topic I was very much focusing on for a few years. So the context of this presentation will be specifically on care robots. Some of the, I mean, I guess a few slides will repeat that, but one of the terminologies or kind of shifts I try to provide will be from robot ethics to a techno ethics on care. So for me, also the wording is very important because what I won't be talking about, and this should not be misunderstood. It might be a bit experimental what I do and provocational, but first of all, I'm quite serious about this. And second, well, maybe I will tell you actually later about this, in the next slides, and give a bit of a brief overview for those who are not aware of what is actually ethics of robots. And some of you might know a few concerns ethicists have, but not really have an overview on the field. It's quite general and I apologize for that, but for this presentation, it's enough. So there are a few ethical schools dealing with robots, and not even specifically social robots because they're a bit of an extra thing. Unfortunately, there are no agreements on where's the line between a social robot, a humanoid robot, a personalized robot. So I guess those things are quite overlapping. with each other. Some things are really very, very blurry in terms of having specific borders or edges. There's robot ethics that gives a bit of an overview. I've mentioned only one person or one book, actually, one publication. There's a more recent discussion on AI ethics. Then there's also data and information ethics, machine ethics, also one of the early kind of drivers of these ethical discussions. I haven't included things like media ethics here. For me, that's a completely different area in terms of what they want and the mindset. It came up, I think, a few times already. It's very hard to summarize the whole mindset of a discipline, but I do see from all those years, I've been in everything involved more or less, or tried to really get a grip on what's happening. I could see a certain, a different kind of approach to even what's an artifact and where's the line between artifacts and humans. The focus today will be very specific on social robots and robot ethics. When I say robot ethics is so much more than just social robots. But in this case, I will just look at this kind of artifact of the humanoid social robot and the implementation of social robots into care. So briefly, as an overview, are care robots a necessity for society? That's one of the questions occupying research fields, and there are quite a few arguments that actually speak for it and for the discussion of at least being open about introducing care robots into societies. When I say societies, well, I have to say mainly, talk about Western societies. I mean, Japan, I count Japan into that as well, because it's one of those driving actually fields and areas on this topic. So lots of research comes actually from Japan as well, and from Japanese views on robots. The fact that people are aging faster, living longer, we have more elderly in the society. These factors play into this. Another factor is we don't have enough human caretakers. Family structures are dissolving. People live by themselves. Well, I think you've heard all those kind of arguments already. It could be also a way to actually ease loneliness. If people are very lonely, there's a theory of better one body than no body. So that's and a robot is a body. So even the physicality of robots could actually be considered much more as in their presence. Robots can help with certain physical tasks, especially if you're injured or cannot move properly, even helping caretakers to assist and so on. So I'm not just talking about care robots completely replacing humans. I think that's that's not even up for discussion, actually. Some robots or some care robots are already more realistic in their use of assistance with medication, with acting as a reminder or as a helper with maybe shopping or cleaning. So these kind of things are actually more likely than this idea of, the kind of the perfect companion robot, even though, who knows, it's debated, but it might not be a very near future. Then at the same time, it might not be a very near future is basically what addresses the idea of the illusion of care robots coming into our society. And from an ethical perspective, the why not discussion has been, of course, bigger than the why yes. For some, the idea even of care robots, again, mostly considered in this context as humanoids, that it can increase loneliness due to the avoidance of human contact. So it could be the opposite of just, being a present body, but rather if it's even considered an uncanny or scary body, it could make people's lives worse and not just better. The fact that they're not yet autonomous or responsive, let's say, creatures or social beings, as even sometimes referred to. That makes the problem, of course, bigger, because how do people interact with non-autonomous and non-responsive things? I think Professor Schutte mentioned yesterday that research showed that people, after a few months, due to some limitations of what robots or interactive robots can do, people get actually bored. I think that's something not as much considered to be a problem, but I think it is one, because if there's not a full responsiveness and interaction, then after a while there's, let's say, 10 questions, we'll just, we'll run out of fashion basically, and we'll start to bore people. So that's something not so much considered in elderly care. The maintenance is a problem. These kind of machines, we don't know how well they function, when don't they function, and who's going to maintain, and what about the costs that come with all that? I think this discussion actually has to be much bigger and much heavier, even on context of data and of AI, because very often we discuss concerns as if it's a one moment decision, as if we just make technology, place it, and then it just runs, while the whole duration of technology in society can first of all transform and change, and it has lots of ups and downs maybe, or different levels of even trust or acceptance. The idea of hurt is also common, but I think it's something that can happen through many things, and it will be rather by accident than on purpose. So the intention, I don't think, is as much of an ethical problem. What is an ethical problem, however, is that especially in elderly care or in care environments, people are very vulnerable, and if left alone, maybe with a robot that by accident does whatever, and those robots are quite heavy things, they're not really easy, and then someone may be overwhelmed or not able to really help themselves out of a situation. So that is definitely something to consider, but it's more of a practical problem. And well, I just basically just mentioned this, but in addition, like the overall topics in the ethical field then are kind of bound together to the idea of objectifying of the elderly. That is definitely a concern. However, I will tell later more about the idea of who are the elderly, and can we just speak about the elderly. This is one of it, already starts the problem a little bit I have with very often we speak, and I call myself a part of this ethical discussion as well. When we talk about the elderly, we're not really sure who we mean by that. So we're generalizing a lot. The problem of isolation I've already mentioned. You can have different debates if you think about people being otherwise completely alone and having no one, but then what's the solution? Giving them a robot or a robot pet, or trying to look into other structural issues in society. So this will come up again, but definitely something to consider. The anthropomorphizing debate is very big. I feel like it's not that big as it was a few years ago, or the main literature is already a bit older on this idea. So I don't have so much a problem of just saying we anthropomorphize things. I don't think that's the critique one can have. That's why I don't buy into the critique of deception. I don't support. However, I think even Bojana just said as a last comment, the idea of deception, if people hide certain motives that are intransparent, that's for me the much bigger issue. And I think one of the great advantages of a potential expansion of an ethical framework could be that one sees how other disciplines talk about exactly the same thing. And then it's much harder to just say, well, for example, the best case is the data. Not actually sure what I said the last thing. Of course, that I will talk more about it in as the slides go on. So the idea is just that we can profit from looking into how other disciplines deal with similar problems, so we can get a better overview on why, for example, deception might be a bit of a different problem very often discussed in this debate. So from my perspective only, but from the experience I had with literature reviewing over the last year, I would say that there are a bit of a two fragmented stream when it comes to care robots. Again, I'm talking only about care robots, which means that one of the discussions is continuously led when it's, to robots or to AI. So one field, I would say, talks more about the perception of care robots or of human robots. Research that deals with anthropomorphism, acceptance, trust, things that we see and things we experience with the care robot. I was just saying that there are two fragmentation in research on social robots. One is rather oriented towards perception and humanoid shape. This means debates on anthropomorphism, acceptance, trust, interactivity. And the other one rather looks at infrastructure, data, intelligence, and technological capacities, but also on kind of technological autonomy or agency of robots. I would say the second one very much drifts into discussions on data issues and AI. So there is almost like a fluent transition from one debate to the other. However, when it comes to care robots, the dominant discussions are very much on the perception part. I do understand why this is the case. However, in my PhD thesis, for example, I dealt with this idea that because back then when I started to work on care robots, I looked at a performance play, and I was quite puzzled by the idea of the robot being presented as this kind of emotional actor, and that has to gain trust. And I actually found that to be slightly deceptive to such an extent that it's not possible yet. So it was presented as if the robot is already highly interactive and autonomous on a technical side. So this is when I started to mix the idea that technical issues are very much part of the anthropomorphical issues, and from there I shifted enough in. I shifted then later into data discussions, and this is where I brought up the problem or concern I actually have with the idea that placing care robots into sensitive environments, like with elderly, but also even with children, has so many more issues than just getting people's trust or acceptance, but having people's full consent and information and transparency out there that these are data devices, that everything they do, if they work properly, by the way, if they, not always they do work properly, but if they work properly, they do collect data on everything. And because they have tracking systems, they engage with people. And I could not find any discussion on people being properly informed on this in these contexts. So that was something I stumbled across very early on. And then I went on to finding out that, and this is then the later research I developed out of this, that there's more a disconnection between robot ethics focusing on the robot. And that's why, well, sorry, I couldn't find a prettier robot. That was the best robot I could find. It's a bit scary, actually. But most debates then in this field focus on, of course, data and the idea of care robots in hospital or institutions, vulnerability, of course, and how to interact with human beings and people being cared of, or elderly children, also different groups. But somehow there was a complete disconnection to the idea of care as a context. So that kind of puzzled me a little bit, because I could see as well that on the other side, in so the idea of the carer, who is this person who will be as much affected by robots if robots are being implemented into care. Again, this is a bit hypothetical and yet quite possible, at least in terms of assistance and assisting technologies. The care profession will be very much affected by this. Educational systems, concepts of care, migration and labor and value of care. I will talk a bit more later because about this, this is kind of part of the discussion as well, but completely neglected in my view. And further, what I then decided to at least try as an idea is to move from a robot-centric ethics and from a non-technological care ethics towards what I will tell you, towards where, but the important part is that I define robot ethics to be actually not human-centered but robot-centric. That's maybe a bit of a different view than most have, but I've come across, of course, the term of human-centered technology, and I'm not always sure what that really means because I rarely have the groups affected by it really part of the discussion. So I would be I'm personally very critical with the term, even though I know what people mean. I know what people mean, but for me, the discussion is still very robot-centric, even though I don't necessarily think it's artifact-centric. So I will talk about that a bit more on another slide. And another thing is that when I look to care ethics, which is the ethical field not dealing at all with technology, but only with how is care changing, what is care, who needs care, what's vulnerability. So they deal with the very medical and psychological aspects. They, at the same time, have absolutely no awareness of what's happening in terms of technological advancement. So I could see there's a bit of a gap in between those two fields. So I then asked myself, okay, so what can I actually do to bring those two things together? Can we have a bit of a different discussion, again, a different kind of ethics? And my title of this presentation is a bit more of an example. So it's a performative ethics. It's just one way to do it. There is other ways as well. And I would summarize my main idea is to try to see the robot as part of the context and not only as an artifact, but as an ethical force. And I will show you a visual where you can, I hope, better see what I mean by that. The main idea is not to be misunderstood as me suggesting an interdisciplinary ethics, because this is not what I do. I don't just say, let's have extra discussions, just summing them up from care ethics and put them into robot ethics and call it, a new form of robot ethics. I really consider this to be a various, like an integration of different layers in the discussion and not just of additions. So I would like for the robot to take a different position. This means, in particular, that we have to ask different questions, in my view, at least. So far, you can have questions like, how does the robot, let's say, change caring? Yeah. You can ask this question in a much more specific way if you even include what caring means in the present state. Very often we talk about an ideal state of caretaking and of caring, while at the same time, caring is transforming all the time. It's not a stable thing. I am very much also convinced that the idea and the value of human caring will change when technology comes in whatever ways, even if it's only by taking over a few tasks, or in a diagnostic way, or in a physical way. Then what or who will care if we advance more and more technology, even in the context of emotional states? So the drive to advance or to position technology as emotional is there, and it's increasingly becoming a topic. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Even AI is now considered to be emotional. Of course, what many researchers mean by this is tracking and emotional recognition, and less the very ability to be emotional. But this is blurry, and it's also, I think, blurry, rhetorically blurry on purpose, but that's another discussion. I say also philosophers, but also roboticists and maybe wider society, who and what will care for what. So how are we going to define the caring as a network, if you want to say, because maybe the robot could assist in the caretaking environment, but then someone has to take care of the robot as well. So it's not going to be a one-way street. How will care evolve? Considering that the argument with robots is very often that they don't get tired and they don't complain, and they don't need a salary, but the maintenance of robots will be quite cost intensive, and it will require people to be trained as well. And who will profit from care? I don't only mean in a monetarily way, but also emotionally. How have we thought that through? Who have we asked? That's for me one of the, again, also major discussions. When I started my research, I tried desperately to find papers on human-robot interaction where people or researchers actually talked to the elderly, or whoever that then is. Of course, I know it's not a homogenic group, but let's say it is in this case. There were barely any papers out there. There was not really much happening. So the only point in which then care environments, even caretakers, but also institutions were asked was when the technology was already implemented. Then they had sometimes a bit of a say in how much issues there are, what to look for, how to change a few things. But I kept asking myself, and how do roboticists actually know what care is about and what to change and what to do? Like, who knows about the issues and of whose issues and who is being asked in all of that? This brings me to one of my, I would say, ambitions in this kind of discussions of opening up the ethical framework, which is robot meets care ethics, that the robot is not placed into a neutral environment. We need to take this into consideration, and not just by adding 2 sentences about, well, the care context is changing, people are aging, society is getting older, and that's why we need care robots. That's for me not the argumentation of such of a really profound ethical discussion. Labor conditions, migration is a huge aspect in this discussion, completely taken out of the context of philosophy of technology. However, it is a huge influence on care ethics. And I think there is a relationship between that. So I do believe that certain trends are intersected. I do believe there's a certain way we devalue and dehumanize labor and dehumanize care is very much showing in how we treat so-called care migrants, how we treat women, how we treat care work, and where and at what point do we implement technology to solve the problem. So this, of course, comes very close to the idea of robot meets a labor ethics, which is another thing more or less ignored. It is not, I mean, I have to be a bit careful because I know that it doesn't mean that people don't care. Okay, the term care comes up a few times now. It doesn't mean that ethicists are not aware of those things or are not interested. I do, however, consider it important to be really integrated into the ethical framework and not just, again, considered like an a very small info on the side. But I think that we need to look at the robot through those problems and not just as a side thing of those problems. And a few I already mentioned, but the idea of gender, I'm very happy that it came up a few times today in some conversations and talks. Of course, there is already research on the gender problematic in robotics, and this is great. But in this case, I mean that the context into which the robot enters has a problem with gender as well, and we need to take that into account. The whole transformation of labor versus emotion, or emotional labor, what is care, where's the line? That's a huge debate in care ethics. I've actually never seen transported into any kind of robot ethics or robotics as such. I take out a little bit of science and technology studies because they intrinsically have a bit of a critical approach, also more influenced by posthumanism and so on. So I'll talk about it later. But these kind of conversations of the scope of tasks, power dynamics, care industry versus patient or client, depends on how you might call the people that are then being cared of. The economical ambitions, techno-solutionism is one of those terms that keeps popping up even in AI ethics. Is more technology always the better thing? Is it a solution to some things? And this is not necessarily me being technophobic, not at all. I just think we can understand certain concerns much better about technology if we look at the dynamics of the area where technology is being then placed into. Because if that area already struggles with certain forms of exploitation, then we need to ask what kind of role will technology play in this? And that's why, ta-da, the visuals. So I will explain this, but I hope the idea comes out of my very complex graphics, is that I'm not necessarily now arguing that the robot should be just one thing in all those other things. I'm still talking about a certain techno-ethics. So I'm still interested in keeping it about the robot. However, I do think that the robot now should not be only considered in its direct relationship to another being, or as data, or as artifact, or as tool, but as a whole layer that goes upon all the other things. So I'm almost wanting to integrate everything into one another. And this is the idea of the layer, is that I want to consider not only the topics around it, but they are not just additional, but the robot as even process, or as a whole narrative of things that might happen to care. We can just talk all those topics through the idea of what robot technology or robot care technology will do to the whole care environment. And this is much more than just saying robot ethics in care, because again, it would mean that care is this thing that is otherwise not already transformed by certain processes that will affect the way robots are used there. It adds up on complexity, of course. So this is without a doubt what is happening. And I will jump a bit back to the idea of, so what am I actually addressing in this thing, in this ethical approach? What am I trying to go away from? And it's not so much what I want to really change. I think at present, certain movements on social robot ethics or on robot ethics are absolutely crucial. And one of them would be, for example, to think about relational approaches like Kugelwerthers, or value-oriented approaches. And this is all very important to go away even from this idea to consider robots as this closed ontology and entity that simulates human beings, but to see everything much more fluid and dynamically. However, and the idea of a process method also came up today with Latour. But my idea goes even further and says, well, this means not, so I still want to open up the relationship between only robot and only human other. I want to include more things. And to include more things would not be enough to just say, and that's why we need to add more topics into the kind of framework. That's why we need to talk about the caretaker, which I already mentioned. We need to talk about the caretaker's biography, about socioeconomic transformation maybe of care, of what's care value. But I also think we need to do more in getting new methods and methodologies into the ethical framework. And this now links to my title on performative, which is just an example, because I'm not quite sure which one, if there is always the idea of performativity to be added. I'm quite open to discuss different forms of approaches. I will talk about the performative and posthumanist approach, but there's also material thinking, which means we look into the idea that everything's matter and agency and interacting with each other. This is very much already shaping media studies or even science and technology studies. Then there's the idea overall of having a transdisciplinary discussion or looking more into wider narratives. So how do we construct narratives of care, and how does the robot position itself into these? And of course, political theory, which for me specifically is a very important addition, because it makes it much more transparent to talk about power relations in specifics than just to talk about care as something completely abstract. Because in the end, the care context, especially the care context, is so vulnerable, as not only because people who are taken care of are vulnerable, but because even the caretakers and the whole idea of what is care and how do we facilitate care is socioeconomically, transforming, but also politically. Well, as I said, one way to add a certain new methodology into the whole framework would be to talk about performativity. Performativity, I will not be able to summarize the whole idea of it, very much influenced by Karen Barat. My use of performativity will be specific and will be, on the terms of understanding it not only as a methodology, but also as a transdisciplinary vessel, which is very fluid and open. This means it's a way of talking about concerns or technology, humans, environments, but also matter and material, agency. So these are different terms and different terminologies. So I'm already leaving robot ethics as such. For me, this is important because we can overcome a few positivist or essentialist debates. One of the essentialist debates, just to give you an example, would be the idea of deception. Because if we consider deception as I'm fooling someone, that this is not really a human being, then I'm kind of considering and implying that only an authentic human being exists, and that an essentially human being is the only thing I should interact with to be, let's say, a fulfilled individual, or to feel interactive, or to feel social. And this can be really challenged. So it's almost like a defense for robots, because they can be other forms of beings without having to be confronted with this idea that they're never going to be humans, because they simply are not going to be humans. And that might not be a problem. However, other things are problems, but okay, that's maybe another discussion, or it's actually part of this discussion, but it's not part of the discussion of essentialism, which can be overcome. It can also help us to think about power dynamics of language and of metaphors. And overall, the main idea of performativity as an approach or as a way of thinking techno studies, techno ethics, but also techno relationships, is to overcome the representational idea, to overcome questions and challenges of saying, well, it's not a human being in its original, that's why it has to be worse. This is almost like a trap that the robot or all forms of technology will actually never really overcome. And it also implies that there is something like an origin of humanness, which I will say in my next slide is actually a completely political debate. Of course, there are downsides to this. It's not so easy. I don't want to make technoethics completely performative. That's why I'm speaking of including new methods into it and not just changing the methodology completely. I'm not in favor of that. I do see downsides as well. Performative approaches, posthumanist approaches as well, tend to be, and process oriented as well. They tend to be very they don't have really clear positioning on who is responsible and who is on the top of the pyramid, basically, which is a great thing if you want to talk about theory and advancing different ways of power dynamics, but it's a very problematic way if you sometimes need to really pinpoint a certain practical problem of the artifact or of the entity. And speaking about robots, I think at least one has to be able to do this, otherwise even policymaking becomes almost impossible. Linking different disciplinary discussions is another downside of this. It can be a problematic one. And the second way, it's related. So performative and posthumous approaches are very much intersected. They don't, they come from a similar, well, similar, I hope I don't really, yeah, I'm kind of out of line here, but the overall idea is to go against an essential view on the human being, but also to question, and this is a posthumanist and very often also gender-led approach, gender-critical approach. Who is the other in this debate? Have we really decided that the robot has to be the other? And is the other of the robot always going to be the opposite of the human? Can we find actually a common ground? Can we find something that might link these two, even if it's entities together? Do we have to talk about entities at all? Can we have a bit of a different discussion of otherness? And posthumanists do have this kind of other discussion. And they don't position human versus technology or human versus environment, which sometimes can be very helpful in overcoming some challenges, but it can also be very helpful in pointing out specific power dynamics we have in, in identity construction, in how we govern, how industry is sometimes the other to the non-industry, how the vulnerable group is sometimes the other to the group that decides. So we can have different forms of paradoxes actually in this power dynamic that don't have necessarily to be robot against human being. And this is, I guess, one of my major points in why different forms of methodologies are so important to be at least considered to get them into this framework. Yeah, well, however, the issue remains similar. It's less application oriented. These discussions are very theoretical and rarely talking about robots. I, however, think that robot ethics or techno-ethics on care, on robots, can profit from that and try to link the practical with the very abstract. The hierarchies debates, of course, it remains not so easy to decide upon. Maybe concepts that are very big in robot ethics, like responsibility, are a bit harder to pinpoint, even though I think they're already very vague. And it requires much more of some kind of management of those discussions, which can be challenging if one is not super familiar with all those terminologies and discussions. But it would look something like this in the end. What would be my idea, at least. This is a similar graphics to the previous one. It's just it gets more colors. The idea is, again, my layering of the discussion. That's what's very important to me. And this is what I want to point out. Not just an addition of topics, but to have a discussion in which we can layer. So we can layer a view on the robot, which I do not see as, outside of ethics. So I'm not saying an ethical traditions is part of my frameworks. Therefore, I don't want to necessarily get rid of ethics on, say, or even I'm not suggesting, oh, let's make the discussion just about legal problems, because I think that they should have place there too. But I'm still very much, engaged in an ethical debate. I just say that part of an ethical debate can be more than just us looking into very brief insights from other disciplines and adding them to the literature review. But it could be a much more focused idea on maybe one problem, but then trying to see what's the context the problem is being introduced to, how could this problem then change the context, what's already happening there, and do we have new methodologies to really explore this maybe a bit more critical or a bit more outside of frameworks that are very traditional or very dualistic in a certain way. And to summarize this whole idea I have is, or my advertisement for this new form of technoethics, I do believe it gives a better overview and insights into not just robot ethics, which of course can remain as an informative, integral part of it, but it gives us such, I mean, in my view at least, it gives a really good insight into what is happening in other fields, which then makes the discussion much richer and deeper to some extent. It allows really to shift from ethical traditions, which are very much applied onto technology or to technology, towards a focus on ethical concerns. And the idea to move from ethical traditions to ethical concerns is, for me, very crucial in this sense, because we can then treat ethics not as a field, but ethics as a way of dealing with concerns, and technology as a process or as a narrative, which also changes the entity debate. So we don't have to treat robots only as the thing that is placed somewhere, just like that, and then or that is just in front of one human being, because there's it's just kind of too abstract to really get to some problems we really face. It allows for more influence of ethics over practical, political, and technological issues. This is something I'm quite convinced of, because I think that this way of doing ethics would also inform other fields much better, because it gives you much more intersections between practical problems too, without having necessarily this doesn't necessarily mean it has to be labeled applied ethics, but I do think that there is an intersection possible. And it opens up the kind of spectrum to issues that are suddenly become so much more apparent. And I'm quite convinced of that, like for sure convinced, because it's just part of my, almost daily work, that I start to see so many things that are completely ignored, either in one field or the other. And then suddenly you can see them much better when you put a lens onto different disciplines, even if it's the same, sometimes same topic. There are downsides of that as well. So the managing of the content and the methods can become quite messy, or can be quite complex. So one has to know exactly maybe the angle, or what is the goal, or what is the specific problem. Danger of superficiality, I actually thought about that a bit more. I'm not quite sure that's really the case, because for me, some discussions at the moment are a bit, at least if not superficial, but then very abstract. So they don't really resolve anything that is more specific in the context. Of course, there's so many debates, so I can't really generalize this. The target group is another thing I even struggled with when I was doing my PhD, because as I said, I started to intuitively mix up a few things. And I have to say, and be quite frank about it, it made my life as a PhD student really hard. It made it very hard, because media scholars couldn't really understand why I'm working on robots. They could understand the methodology, but they didn't understand the robot aspect. Roboticists or robot ethicists couldn't understand the media aspects. And then it became really, a whole new thing. So one has to be able to somehow manage this, and to decide which should be maybe the main goal, or the main discipline. Transdisciplinarity is, in my view, a good thing. However, it does make things like publishing and collaborations really problematic to some extent. You need to find similar people appreciating that, or being open to these kind of views.